Alright, so as I've been saying, I did have another one planned for this week, but after the news of what happened, I decided to go ahead and go through with this one, which we talked about doing a while back, and I think we were even gonna do around the time Batman vs. Superman came out. But somehow it just kind of ended up off to the side, so what better time to do it than now? So, I think we're gonna start with Batman, which obviously came out in 1966, which was right around the time of the TV show. It was a little bit after. And the interesting thing about that is, to my understanding, the movie was seen as like kind of a cash-in at the start on the TV series and its popularity. In actuality, the movie was supposed to be first, yet it just kind of somehow worked out that way that the show came like right before, and the movie was just kind of like almost like right in the middle of it. Um, and you'll notice that it's kind of, for a while there, I don't know if it had an anniversary or if it was just when it came out on DVD or what, but I do remember when it came out on DVD, it had like this massive resurgence. Like, my brother bought it online, and we had never really seen it before. We had seen the TV show when we were kids, but it had been a long time, and so out of complete curiosity, and we were right, I think we were like on the cusp of the Nolan universe coming when that happened, and obviously things were going to start getting darker. We'd obviously already had the darkness with Tim Burton's movie, and then movies, and then obviously the Nolan universe was coming, so there was a bit of people liked this one for the campiness, but there was always that a lot of people kind of shunned it too because it was funny and silly and very just cheesy 60s TV show. Like, it is to my understanding that there was a point in time where like the comics did kind of coincide with that, where much like the Batman movies have their different eras where some were really dark and serious, and then some were quite silly like this. Um, so you'll notice around the time Nolan's universe was getting bigger, they redid the DVD cover to look like this to kind of give it that. I don't know where the logic quite is in this, because obviously even if it gets you to get the movie, you're going to clearly see that the tone is a little bit different than a cover like this might suggest, even if it's still the bat signal that was from the series. Still, it's almost like they tried to advertise it as this darker thing by giving it this cover. I'm not quite sure what they were thinking with that, but I guess that's why it looks like that. So, and then there was a time, obviously, where it did seem like it was a whole lot of silliness before we got into like the Burton stuff. But I do remember, obviously, I had the upside of having already one of Burton's movies already existed when I was born, and Returns was only like 2 years later. So as a kid, I was already differentiating, because my grandparents would watch the TV show all the time, so we would see it all the time, and the Burton movies were also in our lives, so there was kind of always that constant. It didn't feel like there was like a need for them to be the same. There wasn't a reason to shun the silliness of the TV show because there were Burton movies. Um, so I never really kind of. I did try to watch the TV show again probably 6 or 7 years ago, and it was a much more difficult than when I was a kid. But I have always kind of loved this movie ever since my brother got it and we saw it for the first time. It's one of those movies that it has to be up there for movies I've seen the most times of anyone. And obviously, like I've been saying, we have this approach where Batman is kind of known as like this dark vigilante, and usually the cops are after him just as much as criminals are. But in the show and in the movie, even Kika actually asks if they're vigilantes like in the westerns, and their response is they're deputized agents of the law. So they're like, and everybody's always seeing them as this great thing, and when they're in the sky, there's the guy at the picnic that's like, oh, it makes you feel good to know they're doing their jobs and all that, to a comedic extent. And you have to know that it's kind of the point where it's practically, they love what they're doing, but it's also quite obviously parody. when you watch this with the DVD commentary on that Adam West and Burt Ward do, like 90% of the commentary is just them laughing their asses off at what they're looking at. But that was kind of the intention to begin with, but it's always kind of pushed away as this kind of stupid thing when people want this whole darker aspect of pretty much everything, because it's just the time we live in now. But I mean, there is another side to that, where I do know some older people that are like, they don't want the darker stuff, they only want this. But I don't know, I like having that middle ground where I just like taking it all in and just seeing the different variations on it. And as far as the movie itself goes, the interesting thing is that, is kind of how much they, how serious they play it. Like, that's the whole thing, that's the brilliance of what, Burt Ward and especially Adam West do here, is they play everything totally straight-faced. Like, Burt Ward kind of has to do this sort of naive but serious thing, and Adam West just has to do this totally stone-faced, straight, everything is taken super seriously, no matter how ridiculous it gets. Which is really interesting, because when you look at the villains, when usually the villains are the darker aspect of the story, the villains are where, like, they're, like, intentionally played up in a comedic manner. And the movie kind of toys with that also, starting with, obviously everything is super convenient. Like, everything in the Batcave is, like, a specific device for the very out-of-nowhere thing that they needed to do. Like the dust separator at the end, just as one example. The sharp repellent back spray earlier in the first scene of the movie. And here they're able to call up, what, super criminals are at large right now. And it just so happens that they have a database for super criminals not in prison, and it just happens to be the only four that take place in this movie. Starting with the Mastermind is kind of a half and half between the Penguin and Catwoman, but the Mastermind more or less seems to be the Penguin. Though Catwoman is kind of like the smarter of the four of them. And I love the way, I think it's Commissioner Gordon calls him a pompous, waddling master of foul play. And of course we're talking about Burgess Meredith, who most famously would go on to play Mickey and Rocky, but also had like an Oscar-nominated performance in Day of the Locust. He was also nominated for Rocky. And he did the best version of Mice and Men, the 1939 version, which is just outstanding. And here, he has kind of... The interesting thing about Burgess Meredith's Penguin is how much he was able to... Like, when you see the comic book version of the Penguin, it's kind of interesting how as campy as this show is, as far as appearance goes, how close Burgess Meredith actually is, and the very kind of iconic Penguin voice that it kind of even sounds like Danny DeVito is borrowing from, even though Danny DeVito was playing like a half-human version of him. So just everything about that works, but then there's also, there's Lee Meriwether doing Catwoman, because apparently it was supposed to be Julie Newmar, but she was too busy doing McKenna's Gold, I think, the Gregory Peck movie. But here, she's I never really got, like, the whole Catwoman fetish thing, but Lee Meriwether as Kitka is obviously that very alluring and kind of very sexy, if you will, presence. And I also love that particular moment when she's still Kitka at the beginning, and then she's going up the stairs, and one of the pirates calls her Catwoman, and she says, "I told you not to use my real name," and it's... Just the idea, of course, in this world, Catwoman is her real name, because that's just the way we're going. And that also brings us Frank Gorshin, who obviously is just magnificently over the top. Like, it's weird to know that we have Cesar Romero doing a Joker that's, like, really off the wall and, like, does, magic tricks and all that, and has that laugh and that just whole crazy thing about him. Yes, we have a Riddler that is quite possibly even more manic and even more energetic, but you'll hear nobody complain about it because Frank Gorshin is just that amazing. It was even, like, when Jim Carrey played him in Batman Forever, the big deal about that was that he got, like, Frank Gorshin's blessing after he saw what he was doing, and it was just, like, a really big moment. And the way he's able to kind of do it in this way where the Riddler is so manic in this movie, but he's also... There are just these moments where he's just really, like, really downplayed and just, like, really serious. But it's like he can switch to manic just like the flip of a switch. He can just go back and forth. There's even the moment when he's talking about the plan to bring some millionaire into the lair, and he's galloping around saying he knows exactly who to go after, and when he says Bruce Wayne, he goes right back into calm and serious. And it's just amazing to watch him be able to go back and forth, and how when he's manic, he's even bigger than Romero is, and Romero's playing the damn Joker. It's really just a marvel to see. And then, of course, as we were talking about, with Romero playing the Joker with the makeup even over his mustache because he refused to shave it. And there are a lot of great moments with him where he's not... Being the Joker, you would think he'd be... I don't know if the Joker just got more popular down the road in, like, any type of, medium, but here he's very much kind of almost like a background thing. Like, he's there occasionally. Most of his funny moments are just imitating the people around him, like when there's a couple of times where he imitates the Penguin's laugh, or he's, like, mocking the Riddler or something. But he still totally makes it work. I like his back and forth with Commodore Schmidlapp, where he's there's the one, just kind of the way he looks at him after Schmidlapp says, "I got to get caught up on my Dickens," and I always kind of wondered if him saying, "I got to get caught up on my Dickens" is like a very loose reference to the Twilight Zone episode that Burris Meredith was in a few Twilight episodes, but obviously specifically the one where his character was obsessed with Dickens. I kind of like to think, because this is after that, so I would kind of like to think that that's like a kind of a loose reference a little bit. I also just kind of like thinking about the fact that the Joker just looked at him like that because he said getting caught up on my Dickens. But anyway, and of course, obviously you'll know that I believe the show did this too, that really interesting thing where you'll notice whenever the villains are on screen and we're in their lair, because you typically it's kind of a dated expression now, but back in the day, villains were typically referred to as crooked people. So you'll notice that when they're in their lair, like, the sets are kind of leaning and the camera angles are always at a tilt. So I always thought that was kind of an interesting little detail that they added to that. I'm pretty sure that came in the show as well. But as I was saying, so the thing though is just how comedic the villains are in contrast to how straight-faced Adam West and Burr were, which is amazing. Neil Hamilton as Commissioner Gordon also gets a lot of stuff where, like, everything is like the end of the world to him when when they're realizing what's going on. But there are also moments where it's kind of like obviously the riddles that, of course, Robin just happens to know immediately, even if their answer's as ridiculous as a sparrow with a machine gun. But there's one moment where it's almost like, I love what Adam West does here, how everything is absolutely totally serious, no matter how ridiculous it is, especially when he's in the suit, which I imagine was also a bit of a task, but albeit made it even more fun to do. But there's one point when they answer one of the riddles, and it's so ridiculous, and Batman says, because there is, it's the only possible meaning. And I almost felt like sarcasm had slipped out there. Just a little bit. But if it did, maybe that's all for the better. Maybe that just makes it funnier. Because there's even the moment later where, no matter how ridiculous everything gets, there's even the moment when he calls up the Admiral, and the Admiral has just pawned off this boat to the Penguin under a fake name that's basically exactly his name. And even Batman is just saying, this is the dumbest possible thing a person could have ever done. And the Admiral just doesn't get it. So it's fun that they would kind of take those liberties and kind of seem to acknowledge that even in this world there are still legitimately stupid people, even when they're just happy all the time. And also just like I was talking about, how they have a device for everything that is so incredibly convenient. Becomes this great running joke through the whole thing. One of my personal favorite acknowledgments of it was, I can't even remember what the name of it is. It's a really long name, obviously. But it's when he's deflecting the torpedoes and making them blow up before they get to the buoy that they're on. And it's this little battery-operated thing, and not only do they have this it just so happens we have this contraption, but when you know it, the batteries in it are dead, so it doesn't even matter that they have it. That is hilarious. How can you not see that this is all incredibly stupid humor so very much intentionally? And I even love the fact that it's this odd, ridiculous device that just happens to exist and has a really long name, and the Penguin knows that they have it. He knows the name of it. It's like, oh, they must have that. And it's all, it just makes it, there's a reason. I think I've probably seen this movie more than about 95% of the movies that I have, and it's all this stuff. I think another factor that kind of adds to the whole fun of it is how little Batman and Robin are seen outside of their suits. Like, I don't recall a scene off the top of my head that Robin is outside of the opening scene. And then with Bruce, it's just his scenes with Kika, the romance scenes. Whereas me and my brother tend to call it the boring shit. When you see the Pirates with Violins, you know, it's, oh yeah, this old stuff. But still, apart from that opening scene and then the scenes with Kika, I don't think we see Bruce out of the suit. So it's just like almost always a Batman movie. Which I do think is great, especially in this kind of context. And there's definitely a certain, there's an innocence to its goofiness, too. Like, everything is just so damn happy. Every now and then, there is something in there. And it may be misinterpreted stuff. An example of a misinterpreted thing was something that we and all of our friends debated for a very long time shortly after this came out on DVD. And that is when they have kidnapped Bruce Wayne and he's in the lair and they take off his blindfold. And the Riddler says, you think you're pretty clever, don't you, Mr. Wayne? And Bruce says, clever enough to outwit you, you stupid thug. And the big debate was, if you're not paying attention or if you're just kind of casually watching, even if you're kind of somewhat listening closely, you could swear you hear clever enough to outwit you, you stupid fuck. And the funny thing about that is that first thing we did, of course, was check the subtitles on the DVD. And the line isn't subtitled. It stops at clever enough to outwit you. So, but no, I'm pretty sure, I don't remember what exactly proved it. It could just be if you listen hard enough. I'm pretty sure he says thug, but just for my own amusement, sometimes I like to imagine it's the other. And then there's stuff where it's kind of hard to interpret what could really be going on. Maybe it's that, maybe it's not. I'm, of course, talking about that little moment when, they're talking about everything seems to be falling into place, and the Riddler comes hopping across the room and says there's nothing to link us to the crime. And then he leans on that little mantle there, and it looks like he has stopped everything he's doing to just stare directly at Catwoman's tits. Once again, this could be misinterpreted, but that's exactly what the scene looks like. But why would something so PG and innocent have that in it? I don't know, the 60s were an interesting time. But, not to say that's what happens, but I like to feel like, with all the innocence going around, which is a large appeal of it, maybe that stuff is in there on purpose. It's hard to say. But yes, overall, we say this and we talk about how stupid it is. One thing that adds to the hilarity is the obvious stunt doubles. How people are standing here, people are standing here, and then there's a cut when a fight's going to break out, and suddenly the Riddler is an entirely different person. And when they're fighting on the submarine at the end, it's like they're fighting, and then instead of being hit into the water or thrown into the water, it's like they just give up and throw themselves. Or run in by themselves. Like the whole thing where I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be the Riddler's on that hook thing and Batman flings him into the water, but it's clear this stunt double, clearly not Frank Gorshin, is just taking off into the water. And just hilarity ensues at all times. But apart from that, it also kind of feels like there is a cleverness hiding in the ridiculousness, because obviously all of this is so clearly on purpose. There's the whole thing where obviously the Penguin's the Penguin, the Joker's the Joker, white face and green hair at all. Yet when they go into the United building, it's like they wear the masks as if that's going to conceal their identity, as if trying to take the Batman and Robin approach, where a mask is all it takes to mask their identity. But we still see the very visible attributes of these of these villains. Their most recognizable aspects are still very much in the foreground here. And then there's stuff like, the Penguin wants $1 billion from each country to rehydrate everybody, and he wants it sent by carrier pigeon. I mean, there's no other possible way you can see this movie other than just absolutely delightful in its silliness. There's no reason to push it to the side because it's not dark. There's no reason to push it to the side because it's really parody more than anything else. So there's a self-awareness here, and here's the thing is, nowadays self-awareness is such like an in thing. It's very, very trendy right now to be self-aware. Back in 1966, this was self-awareness at a peak. There's really no other way to see it. So, but I do understand that when it came out initially, people kind of didn't like it. They thought it was a cash-in on the TV series. They thought it missed the mark on the campy humor. I don't know if it's just because this is like a campiness peak in today's world or what, but yes, it's kind of hard to believe that when this was out, people didn't really take to it in the way it was supposed to be taken to. So, but it's, yes, I just can't get enough of it. And every time I do watch it, it's usually like 2 or 3 times in that week. So. just because, and it's kind of like a movie comfort food too. Like if there's literally nothing else doing, or if I have something to do but I'm in this room, I'll just put it on just for the sake of it, just to have it there, because I guess it's comforting and it's always amusing no matter after how many times. So, and a lot of that is due to like I said, our very tragic loss, having an actor that could play this part so perfectly and so, whether you like it or not, iconically. To the point, obviously, we talked about that in Kick-Ass, when Nicolas Cage is playing Big Daddy, he's doing an Adam West impression when he's doing that, and it really kind of set up this whole thing of this, like I said, it was like self-awareness at a whole new peak, long before it was super, super trendy, so, yeah, there's just all kinds of reasons to love it. And then going 12 years later, Superman, after apparently it took like 5 years to get a Superman movie off the ground once they tried to start. And then we ended up with the Richard Donner's movie, which ended up obviously being the starting point for our franchise. And the great thing about this movie to completely start off with is that it embraces the comic book background immediately. Like, there's always that question of, if there's a comic book movie, it's like, will it stay true to the comics? Is always the very first question. And this movie opens with black and white footage of a comic book opening. So there's, and this was obviously at a time when this was not particularly popular, certainly not, by today's standards, certainly not. And you also notice that not only did it start off with that kind of loving tribute by saying, we love comic books and we want to make this movie for you as people who love comic books and appreciate this story and appreciate this iconic character. We're going to put some prestige in it. Obviously, even though Christopher Reeves plays Superman, he's not even he's third in the credits, and the 2 credits before him are pre-title. It is Brando Hackman, the title, then Christopher Reeve. And obviously that's for a number of reasons. Number one, Brando is pretty much at a high point here that hardly anybody's ever reached, where he was always first credited. The very next year, no matter how small he was in it, he's in the first 20 minutes of this and that's about it. And he got the first credit. Obviously the very next year, he's at the very end of Apocalypse Now and still managed to get the top of that. But obviously also we have Gene Hackman as our villain, who had already had his Oscar for The French Connection by this point. So they added like a real prestige factor to this before we even set off. But that's not to undermine, obviously, apparently they had to do like a big talent search to find a Superman, and typically you think talent searches are like, well, they'll say it's a talent search, but it's still going to be like somebody's nephew or somebody the production assistant knows or something. But no, they actually found somebody that not only looked the part, like he just looks like Superman just right off the page, but that he can play both parts really well too, because he's got to be really confident and everything is good Superman while also being like, clumsy spaz Clark Kent, and he's able to go back and forth quite good. I really love just how spastic he makes Clark Kent. Like, he really, really went all out and making Clark Kent just the nerdiest, dorkiest guy possible. Just a dude that you can tell, even though he's like Christopher Reeves' height and build, he's still a guy that could get walked all over. And then totally and completely be Superman when he had to be Superman. Be a guy that loses two fathers in the first half hour of the movie, and still be able to be somebody that doesn't have to brood. No offense to Henry Cavill or anything like that, or Zack Snyder's approach. I'm just saying it's so kind of refreshing when you look back and see a superhero that could lose two fathers in the span of half an hour, as well as hardly knowing who he is or where he's from, or learning that very late in his life, and still being able to see the world as nothing but I'm going to save all these people, and I'm not going to, brood. I'm not going to be upset and think the world's a horrible place. I'm just going to go out there and do what I need to do to make it better. And Reeve really accomplished that, personally. So, I said personally just now, and I meant to say perfectly. It's getting very hot in here. And so the next thing is the effects, and the effects obviously were completely unmatched at this time, and this was just absolutely gigantic at the time. Like, it's really interesting to see how much we kind of take advantage of what we have now, where all the superhero movies have all these really big climaxes, and we're like, yes, we've seen this a billion times before. But back then, the climax of this movie was enormous, and people had really hardly seen anything like it. Movies like Earthquake and like big disaster movies had been out at that point. But, and like Hackman himself had done the Poseidon Adventure 6 years prior to this. But in a movie like this, where it kind of wasn't really played up as this really big kind of thing, it was all kind of this very comic booky world. Like, I think there's a reason it really opens up with the comic book opening, is because it just seems like it pops right out of that world, not just with Christopher Reeve, but everything around it. And you have these sets, like the Metropolis set and the stuff in Kansas, and then Krypton is just incredible looking. That entire first 20 minutes where like everything is just white and shiny and glowing, and you've got Brando doing his whole thing. You've got the opening that introduces Zod that takes us... We would have never thought that whole opening is just building up to a big sequel. Regardless of, like, at the end of the end credits when it says next year Superman 2, even though it was like 3 years later. But, but still, the sets in particular match the greatness of the effects and just makes everything feel totally massive and incredibly epic. While also remaining just this really, really fun comic book movie and not taking itself too seriously at all. And there's also those times where it can make fun of itself. Like there is, obviously there's the whole phone booth cliche, where Superman goes in as Clark Kent, and then he comes out and he's Superman. And so Clark gets the idea to do this, and it's a payphone with no booth, and he has to try something else. He has to do the revolving door. And the way they kind of turn that little expectation on its head a little bit is fantastic. Then there's moments that are like the poor little innocent girl with the kitten in the tree, that goes and tells her mom that a flying man came and got her cat out of the tree. And we hear the mother say, "Stop telling lies," and a slapping sound. It's really great that they're able to put those comedic moments in there while also not straying away from Superman being the Superman that we know and love and that everybody had read about in the comics up to that point in 1978. There's even a couple of moments where he not quite, but he almost breaks the fourth wall. Like he's like gets very, very close to it, where like when they get mugged and then he catches the bullet, but when he opens it and looks, he doesn't quite look at the camera, but he looks like right off to the side of it. And then he does that again when he's in Lois's apartment and kind of almost gives away his identity, and then just kind of looks in this direction right before he closes the door. So, speaking of Lois, the other characters in the movie, the main ones anyway, obviously Mara Kidder is fantastic here and looks fantastic, where she's able to kind of give us the vibe that she is this ruthless reporter, But she also has those little weaknesses, like Superman makes her weak in the knees pretty much instantly, and regardless of being a ruthless reporter, she can't spell. Uh, and there are also those moments where you kind of think the love story, you're not kind of when love stories are going to make their way into a movie that haven't had a love story up to this point, you always kind of worry how it's going to go down and what kind of impact it's going to have on the movie. But honestly, I argue to say some of the better scenes in this movie are the ones where it's not even really scenes, it's like one really big scene where they don't really stretch it out because it's kind of, she meets him, they do the interview, and then he takes her flying, and then that's it. But it's all kind of one big thing. In any other movie, this probably would have been stretched out into a lot of different scenes, but they just really put it all in this one thing. And there's always that question of, well, gosh, she fell for Superman awfully fast, but I suppose there's always that thing there where she may not realize right away that Clark without the glasses is literally Superman, but it's kind of like maybe that familiarity with Clark is in the back of her head, and it's all kind of tying together, because obviously it's still Clark and Superman both in this moment, but she thinks it's just one and not the other, but really it's all happening at the same time for all characters involved here. Because I kind of struggle with that whole thing where it's a cliche now, but like Bill was talking about in Kill Bill 2, where it's in all the other superheroes like Peter Parker and Bruce Wayne, they're all the real people, and Batman and Spider-Man are the costumes, and in this, of course, he really is Superman and Clark Kent is the costume, so it's really hard to distinguish when you're talking about who's who here, but yes, Superman is the real person for sure, and this movie does a very good job of playing that up, showing how much of a costume it really is when he is Clark, because he takes on that whole other spastic personality. Long story short, I love the Lois scenes. And even when they throw the innuendos in there, like when she says, for 1978, in a PG-rated movie about Superman, the innuendos are really in there with the, how big are you, and she wants to know about his bodily functions. And then there is the, she asks what color her underwear is, and we realize that he's looking, he just can't, he's just waiting to see until he can really identify. And then, of course, that nice, beautiful moment when she asks if he can read minds, and the only answer to that question we get as an audience is we just get her voiceover. And after a while, we realize that's him reading her mind, and this is what she's thinking, and it's a really beautiful scene. And going on to our villain, Gene Hackman playing Lex Luthor, which had to have been amazing news to hear back in the day. Like, I can only imagine hearing news like that today, but it's, like an actor this big and with this much prestige playing this big part, in this superhero movie, the villain role. I do think that one big problem with this Lex Luthor is because it's not even necessarily the way his character is, it's because of the people around him. He's played up in a very humorous fashion, and like a lot more humorous than he probably should be. It kind of takes away from his villainy a little bit when he always has to be screaming at Otis, because Otis, Ned Beatty, we all love Ned Beatty, we really, really do. But I mean, here it's like he's supposed to be the idiot sidekick, and like his opening scene, his plot to steal from a vendor is foiled by a dog. And then there are the dudes that are following him, they're saying, like, it's amazing his brain can generate the power to keep walking. That's how dumb he is. And that he pretty much always has to be dealing with Otis and screaming at Otis. And it makes his character almost like they're supposed to be like a Laurel and Hardy type. And that's weird. Like, there has to be, like, it's not Lex Luthor, the big, and then Otis is kind of here. It's almost like they're supposed to be the straight man and the funny guy, and it just doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't work. Lex Luthor's supposed to be, like, this big villain here. But that's not to say he doesn't get those big moments. He does have those moments with Otis where it's like, me and you have the number 200 in common, it's my IQ and your weight. There is stuff like that, but then there's also these really big moments, like, I love when, what is that line? When he says, when Superman says, like, so this is how you get your kicks, planning the deaths of innocent people, and he says, no, I get my kicks causing the deaths of innocent people. That's an amazing villain line. And then there's also a really great moment when he's, what is her name? Miss Tessmacher, I think, Valerie Verine's character. where it's like, he says he wants to take out the whole coast plus Hackensack, New Jersey. And he says, and I love that she's there to call out the whole, all Lex Luthor wants is land, land, land cliche that's gone on to be in pretty much the rest of the movies that they called out the first time. But she just goes to him and she's like, but my mom lives in Hackensack. That way, he doesn't say anything. He just looks at his watch and then shakes his head at her and walks out. That is an amazing villain moment as well. And I really wish he could have been more like that through the whole movie instead of being more like the straight man to Otis. It was way too much focus on that when there is definitely an amazing villain here that he plays incredibly, especially in those really sinister moments. And going on the length, too, I said the word epic earlier, and yeah, the movie is 2.5 hours, and it takes a lot. Like, it's over an hour in before Superman starts to really be Superman. And a lot of people kind of chalk that up to not being something that really was taken on until Batman Begins. But here, there's so much. We get the great Krypton stuff that's like the first 20 minutes. Then the stuff in Kansas with Glenn Ford, who's one of my favorite actors from the 50s. Blackboard Jungle is one of the best movies ever, just so you know. And then finally, we get the moment when he turns into Superman after everything else has been introduced. And then after over an hour of waiting, we get just all the stuff at once. Like, he saves Lois in the helicopter. He stops the criminals on the side of the building. He stops Air Force One from crashing. We just get big moment after big moment pretty much from then on. And then, of course, with the dams breaking and the volcanoes going off, the climax is just incredible. And then the whole turning back time by spinning the world another direction is just... It's all just massive on this huge scale we hadn't seen before back then. Obviously not we, but the people in 1978. And the pacing is just perfect with that. And like I said, people really kind of chalk up long superhero movies being a new thing, and it's typically a complaint. But it's even longer. This is the extended version that's like 10 minutes longer. And then to my understanding, the TV version adds like 49 minutes. So it's like this movie could be endless, really. And so, but on top of it all, it actually has a sophistication to it to where it can really have fun with itself, but not necessarily go into parody. Not that it's bad to go into parody, as Batman showed us, but I really like the way Superman's able to do kind of a comic book movie that has fun with itself, but also kind of does it in this way that feels naturally iconic, and really feels like a massive movie and a massive spectacle, while having all these different aspects going into it. So I do think Superman pulls off everything much better and bigger, but like I said, as far as me wanting a movie to watch over and over and over again, I would definitely go with Batman. But yeah, so two different reasons to love them, but they're both movies that embrace their characters with love and have fun with them, and do them in different ways that you may not necessarily see done today, which is always nice. So that's what we have here. As I said, next week's will be a double collaboration between a director and an actor, and there's some very heavy violence there too, and all the usual stuff. I still haven't figured out what the movie is next week at the theater, but I will. I think it's Transformers, but I don't remember for sure. So yes, that's what this is. And so we remember Adam West very, very fondly. Also, he has a nice part at the beginning of the movie, The Young Philadelphians, for like the first 20 minutes or so. He's really good in as well, playing it seriously. So, seriously in a serious movie for once. But so, yes, that's what we have here, and I'm sure these will both be enjoyed just as much as they are now and as they were at the time, for a very, very long time. So, that's it.